There's been, ever since the time of David, a desire to have a temple for God, house of God. And in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we see, David's hands were full of violence, and because of the violence, God could not allow him to build the temple. He told him he would allow his seed to build the temple, and he mentions this in 2 Samuel 7:12. And when thy days shall be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I could argue that that prophecy has not been fulfilled. Yes, it's true that Solomon did build a temple for God. But did he establish his kingdom forever? We know that the things that God had promised Israel were conditional on them keeping their agreement with God, keeping the commandments of God, keeping the Sabbaths in the land, and so on. And these things Israel failed to do. And they went hurrying after other nations, and it was just a matter of time before they became servants of those nations. For those gods that they would go after, those would be the ones they would serve. And so that temple was eventually destroyed. Under Cyrus, the command went out to allow Israel to return to the land, and they built a second temple. And that temple also, Jesus walked with it with his disciples, and they wondered after how great that temple was, and they spoke with him about it, and he told them that not one stone would be left unturned, that the whole temple would be razed to the ground. And yet, as we look at certain prophecies, we see in the future there is still to be a temple. Look at Ezekiel chapter 47, for example, and the whole chapter, really from Ezekiel 40 onwards, chapter 40 onwards, talks about a temple for Israel. Now, some of that may have been fulfilled. Ezekiel 40 through 46, that may have been fulfilled in the second temple, because Ezekiel spoke to the Israelites when they were captive in Babylon. But 47 clearly is future, because this goes on to describe these waters in 47:1 that issued out from under the threshold of the house eastward, for the forefront of the house stood toward the east, and the waters came down from under the right side of the house at the south side of the altar. So here's where the waters come out from this house. Right from the threshold or the base of the house, the waters are coming out. And the prophet in his vision goes on to describe how these waters get deeper and deeper and deeper up to the ankles and then up to the knees, and then such a great river proceeds forth from this house that no man can even pass over it in verse 5. And then he sees trees on either side of it, verse 7. And then these waters would go toward the east country and down into the desert, into the sea, and the waters would be healed there. That hasn't happened. That hasn't come true. Those events have not taken place. This is a future temple. So it's no wonder that today many are so concerned with the rebuilding of this temple. You could call it the third temple. Some call it the fourth. Third temple, some believe that Herod rebuilt parts of the temple, and so some refer to it as the fourth. I refer to it as the third because to me Herod was no man of God and had no authority, and the temple had to be built by the hands of those who serve God, and therefore I see this future temple as a third temple. And you can read all about that in Ezekiel chapter 40 through 47. Joel also describes it, and he says in chapter 3 and verse 16, how the Lord shall roar forth out of Zion, and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake. And he mentions in verse 17 that he will dwell in Zion, his holy mountain, and that Jerusalem shall be holy, and strangers shall not pass through her anymore. And he mentions that a fountain shall come forth of the house of the Lord. These prophecies were all made to Israel. Israel today, there are those in Israel who are busy with establishing the third temple. There's a museum where you can go right now and see all the vessels that have been made for the third temple. They've already made things for the altar, things for the sacrifice of the animals. And of course, the way Israel sees it is that the third temple, when it's rebuilt and established, they would then bring animal sacrifice back. Why would they do this? Because it is necessary for the feast keeping. The feasts, to be properly kept, were always kept in the land of Israel. When Moses gave instruction to the tribes of Israel as they were going to exit the wilderness and come into the promised land, he said, "When ye enter the land, ye shall keep these feasts." These feasts were all tied to the land of Israel, and specifically to the altar, and that altar being of that temple. And therefore, to keep these feasts, Israel, who have not accepted Jesus, who are still waiting for their Messiah, are still in that feast-keeping mode, because all the feasts point to Jesus. We know the Passover is the Paschal Lamb, pointing to Jesus. We understand that Jesus is our atonement. He's our dwelling place, and therefore our tabernacle. And so many things are pointing to Jesus. The feasts are so critical and so important because they point to Jesus, and He is the fulfillment of these things. Did He abolish anything? He fulfilled. He made them come true. And where did His sacrifice take place as a Paschal Lamb? It had to take place on that very mount. Jesus couldn't have been crucified anywhere else and fulfill prophecy. He would have been a false Messiah anywhere else. And therefore, we see the importance of fulfilling God's Word in everything He did. Every step Jesus took fulfilled God's Word.